pride of Kshatriyas. He also claimed to have ensured that there was no intermarriage amongst members of the 4 Varnas. At the same time, he entered into a marriage alliance with the kin of Rudradaman. As you can see from this example, integration within the framework of caste was often a complicated process. The Satavahanas claimed to be Brahmanas, whereas according to the Brahmanas, kings ought to have been Kshatriyas. They claimed to uphold the fourfold Varna order, but entered into marriage alliances with people who were supposed to be excluded from the system. And, as we have seen, they practiced endogamy instead of the exogamous system recommended in the Brahmanical texts. 3.3 Jadis and social mobility. These complexities are reflected in another term used in texts to refer to social categories, jati. In Brahmanical theory, jati, like Varna, was based on birth. However, while the number of Varnas was fixed at 4, there was no restriction on the number of jadis. In fact, whenever Brahmanical authorities encountered new groups, for instance, people living in forests such as the Nishadas, or wanted to assign a name to occupational categories such as the goldsmith or Savarnakara, which did not easily fit into the fourfold Varna system, they classified them as a jati. Jadis which shared a common occupation or profession were sometimes organized into shrinas or guilds. We seldom come across documents that record the histories of these groups. But there are exceptions. One interesting stone inscription, c. 5th century CE, found in Mandsaur, Madhya Pradesh, records the history of a guild of silkweavers who originally lived in Lata, Gujarat, from where they migrated to Mandsaur, then known as Dashapura. It states that they undertook the difficult journey along with their children and kinfolk, as they had heard about the greatness of the local king, and wanted to settle in his kingdom. The inscription provides a fascinating glimpse of complex social processes and provides insights into the nature of guilds or shrinas. Although membership was based on a shared craft specialization, some members adopted other occupations. It also indicates that the members shared more than a common profession. They collectively decided to invest their wealth, earned through their craft, to construct a splendid temple in honor of the sun god. 3.4 Beyond the 4 Varnas, integration. Given the diversity of the subcontinent, there were, and always have been, populations whose social practices were not influenced by Brahmanical ideas. When they figure in Sanskrit texts, they are often described as odd, uncivilized, or even animal-like. In some instances, these included forest dwellers for whom hunting and gathering remained an important means of subsistence. Categories such as the Nisheda, to which Ekalavya is supposed to have belonged, are examples of this. Others who were viewed with suspicion included populations such as nomadic pastoralists, who could not be easily accommodated within the framework of settled agriculturists. Sometimes those who spoke non-Enskritic languages were labeled as mlechchas and looked down upon. There was nonetheless also a sharing of ideas and beliefs between these people. The nature of relations is evident in some stories in the Mahabharata. 3.5 Beyond the 4 Varnas, subordination and conflict. While the Brahmanas considered some people as being outside the system, they also developed a sharper social divide by classifying certain social categories as untouchable. This rested on a notion that certain activities, especially those connected with the performance of rituals, were sacred and by extension pure. Those who considered themselves pure avoided taking food from those they designated as untouchable. In sharp contrast to the purity aspect, some activities were regarded as particularly polluting. These included handling corpses and dead animals. Those who performed such tasks, designated as chandalas, were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Their touch and, in some cases, even seeing them was regarded as polluting by those who claimed to be at the top of the social order. The Manusmriti laid down the duties of the chandalas. They had to live outside the village, use discarded utensils, and wear clothes of the dead and ornaments of iron. They could not walk about in villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and serve as executioners. Much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Fa Xian, c. 5th century CE, wrote that untouchables had to sound a clapper in the streets so that people could avoid seeing them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Xuanzang, c. 7th century, observed that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city. By examining non-Brahmanical texts which depict the lives of Chandalas, historians have tried to find out whether Chandalas accepted the life of degradation prescribed in the Shastras. Sometimes, these depictions correspond with those in the Brahmanical texts. But occasionally, there are hints of different social realities. 4. Beyond birth. Resources and status. If you recall the economic relations discussed in Chapter 2, you will realize that slaves, landless agricultural laborers, hunters, fisherfolk, pastoralists, peasants, village headmen, craftspersons, merchants, and kings emerged as social actors in different parts of the subcontinent. Their social positions were often shaped by their access to economic resources. Here we will examine the social implications of access to resources in certain specific situations. 4.1 Gendered access to property. Consider first a critical episode in the Mahabharata. During the course of the long-drawn rivalry between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, Duryodhana invited Yudhisthira to a game of dice. The latter, who was deceived by his rival, staked his gold, elephants, chariots, slaves, army, treasury, kingdom, the property of his subjects, his brothers, and finally himself, and lost all. Then he staked their common wife Draupadi and lost her too. Issues of ownership, foregrounded in stories such as this one, also figure in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. According to the Manusmriti, the paternal estate was to be divided equally amongst sons after the death of the parents, with a special share for the eldest. Women could not claim a share of these resources. However, women were allowed to retain the gifts they received on the occasion of their marriage as stridhana, literally, a woman's wealth. This could be inherited by their children, without the husband having any claim on it. At the same time, the Manusmriti warned women against hoarding family property, or even their own valuables, without the husband's permission. You have read about wealthy women such as the Vakataka queen Prabhavati Gupta. However, cumulative evidence, both epigraphic and textual, suggests that while upper-class women may have had access to resources, land, cattle, and money were generally controlled by men. In other words, social differences between men and women were sharpened because of the differences in access to resources. 4.2 Varna and access to property. According to the Brahmanical texts, another criterion, apart from gender, for regulating access to wealth was Varna. As we saw earlier, the only occupation prescribed for Shudras was servitude, while a variety of occupations were listed for men of the first three Varnas. If these provisions were actually implemented, the wealthiest men would have been the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. That this corresponded to some extent with social realities is evident from descriptions of priests and kings in other textual traditions. Kings are almost invariably depicted as wealthy, priests are also generally shown to be rich, though there are occasional depictions of the poor Brahmana. At another level, even as the Brahmanical view of society was codified in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, other traditions developed critiques of the Varna order. Some of the best known of these were developed within early Buddhism, c. 6th century BCE onwards, see also Chapter 4. The Buddhists recognized that there were differences in society, but did not regard these as natural or inflexible. They also rejected the idea of claims to status on the basis of birth. 4.3 An alternative social scenario, sharing wealth. So far we have been examining situations where people either claimed or were assigned status on the basis of their wealth. However, there were other possibilities as well, situations where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserly or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised. One area where these values were cherished was ancient Tamil Akam, where, as we saw earlier, there were several chiefdoms around 2000 years ago. Amongst other things, the chiefs were patrons of bards and poets who sang their praise. Poems included in the Tamil Sangam anthologies often illuminate social and economic relationships, suggesting that while there were differences between rich and poor, those who controlled resources were also expected to share them. 5. Explaining social differences. A social contract. The Buddhists also developed an alternative understanding of social inequalities, and of the institutions required to regulate social conflict. In a myth found in a text known as the Sutta Pitaka, they suggested that originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodily forms, nor was the world of plants fully developed. All beings lived in an idyllic state of peace, taking from nature only what they needed for each meal. However, there was a gradual deterioration of this state as human beings became increasingly greedy, vindictive, and deceitful. This led them to wonder, what if we were to select a certain being who should be wrathful when indignation is right, who should censure that which should rightly be censured and should banish him who deserves to be banished? We will give him in return a proportion of the rice, chosen by the whole people. He will be known as Mahasamita, the great elect. This suggests that the institution of kingship was based on human choice, with taxes as a form of payment for services rendered by the king. At the same time, it reveals recognition of human agency in creating and institutionalizing economic and social relations. There are other implications as well. For instance, if human beings were responsible for the creation of the system, they could also change it in future. 6. Handling texts. Historians and the Mahabharata. If you look through the sources cited in this chapter once more, you will notice that historians consider several elements when they analyze texts. They examine whether texts were written in Prakrit, Pali, or Tamil, languages that were probably used by ordinary people, or in Sanskrit, a language meant almost exclusively for priests and elites. They also consider the kinds of text. Were these mantras, learned and chanted by ritual specialists, or stories that people could have read or heard and then retold if they found them interesting? Besides, they try to find out about the author, whose perspectives and ideas shaped the text, as well as the intended audience, as, very often, authors keep the interests of their audience in mind while composing their work. And they try and ascertain the possible date of the composition or compilation of the texts as well as the place where they may have been composed. It is only after making these assessments that they draw on the content of texts to arrive at an understanding of their historical significance. As you can imagine, this is a particularly difficult task for a text as complex as the Mahabharata. 6.1 Language and Content. Let us look at the language of the text. The version of the Mahabharata we have been considering is in Sanskrit, although there are versions in other languages as well. However, the Sanskrit used in the Mahabharata is far simpler than that of the Vedas, or of the Prashastas discussed in Chapter 2. As such, it was probably widely understood. Historians usually classify the contents of the present text under two broad head sections that contain stories, designated as the narrative, and sections that contain prescriptions about social norms, designated as didactic. This division is by no means watertight. The didactic sections include stories, and the narrative often contains a social message. However, generally historians agree that the Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic, moving story, and that the didactic portions were probably added later. Interestingly, the text is described as an idihasa within early Sanskrit tradition. The literal meaning of the term is thus it was, which is why it is generally translated as history. Was there a real war that was remembered in the epic? We are not sure. Some historians think that the memory of an actual conflict amongst kinfolk was preserved in the narrative, others point out that there is no other corroborative evidence of the battle. 6.2 Author, and dates. Who wrote the text? This is a question to which there are several answers. The original story was probably composed by charioteer bards known as Sutas who generally accompanied Kshatriya warriors to the battlefield, and composed poems celebrating their victories and other achievements. These compositions circulated orally. Then, from the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas took over the story and began to commit it to writing. This was the time when chiefdoms such as those of the Kurus and Panchalas, around whom the story of the epic revolves, were gradually becoming kingdoms. Did the new kings want their Itihasa to be recorded and preserved more systematically? It is also possible that the upheavals that often accompanied the establishment of these states, where old social values were often replaced by new norms, are reflected in some parts of the story. We notice another phase in the composition of the text between c. 200 BCE and 200 CE. This was the period when the worship of Vishnu was growing in importance, and Krishna, one of the important figures of the epic, was coming to be identified with Vishnu. Subsequently, between c. 200 and 400 CE, large didactic sections resembling the Manusmriti were added. With these additions, a text which initially perhaps had less than 10,000 verses grew to comprise about 100,000 verses. This enormous composition is traditionally attributed to a sage named Vyasa. 6.3 The Search for Convergence. The Mahabharata, like any major epic, contains vivid descriptions of battles, forests, palaces, and settlements. In 1951-52, the archaeologist B.B. Lal excavated at a village named Hastinapura in Meerut, Uttar Pradesh. Was this the Hastinapura of the epic? While the similarity in names could be coincidental, the location of the site in the upper Ganga Dub, where the Kuru kingdom was situated, suggests that it may have been the capital of the Kurus mentioned in the text. Lal found evidence of 5 occupational levels, of which the second and third are of interest to us. This is what Lal noted about the houses in the second phase, c. 12th-7th centuries BCE. Within the limited area excavated, no definite plans of houses were obtained, but walls of mud and mud bricks were duly encountered. The discovery of mud plaster with prominent reed marks suggested that some of the houses had reed walls plastered over with mud. For the third phase, c. 6th-3rd centuries BCE, he noted, houses of this period were rebuilt of mud brick as well as burnt bricks. Soakage jars and brick drains were used for draining out refuse water, while terracotta ring wells may have been used both as wells and drainage pits. Was the description of the city in the epic added after the main narrative had been composed, when, after the 6th century BCE, urban centers flourished in the region? Or was it a flight of poetic fancy, which cannot always be verified by comparisons with other kinds of evidence? Consider another instance. One of the most challenging episodes in the Mahabharata is Draupadi's marriage with the Pandavas, an instance of polyandry that is central to the narrative. If we examine the section of the epic that describes this event, it is evident that the author, attempted to explain it in a variety of ways. Present-day historians suggest that the fact that the author, describe a polyandrous union indicates that polyandry may have been prevalent amongst ruling elites at some point of time. At the same time, the fact that so many different explanations are offered for the episode suggests that polyandry gradually fell into disfavor amongst the Brahmanas, who reworked and developed the text through the centuries. Some historians note that while the practice of polyandry may have seemed unusual or even undesirable from the Brahmanical point of view, it was, and is, prevalent in the Himalayan region. Others suggest that there may have been a shortage of women during times of warfare, and this led to polyandry. In other words, it was attributed to a situation of crisis. Some early sources suggest that polyandry was not the only or even the most prevalent form of marriage. Why then did the author, choose to associate this practice with the central characters of the Mahabharata? We need to remember that creative literature often has its own narrative requirements and does not always literally reflect social realities. 7. A dynamic text. The growth of the Mahabharata did not stop with the Sanskrit version. Over the centuries, versions of the epic were written in a variety of languages through an ongoing process of dialogue between peoples, communities, and those who wrote the texts. Several stories that originated in specific regions or circulated amongst certain people found their way into the epic. At the same time, the central story of the epic was often retold in different ways. And episodes were depicted in sculpture and painting. They also provided themes for a wide range of performing arts plays, dance and other kinds of narrations. Most retellings or reenactments of the epic draw on the main narrative in creative ways. Let us look at one example, an episode from the Mahabharata that has been transformed by Mahashweta Devi, a contemporary Bengali writer known for raising her voice against all forms of exploitation and oppression. In this particular instance, she works out alternative possibilities from the main story of the Mahabharata and draws attention to questions on which the Sanskrit text is silent. The Sanskrit text describes how Duryodhana plotted to kill the Pandavas by inviting them to stay in a specially prepared house of lac, which he planned to set on fire. Forewarned, the Pandavas dug a tunnel to ensure their escape. Then Kunti arranged for a feast. While most of the invitees were Brahmanas, a Nisheta woman came with her 5 sons. When they were satiated with drink and fell off to sleep, the Pandavas escaped, setting fire to the house. When the bodies of the woman and her sons were discovered, people thought that the Pandavas were dead. In her short story titled Kunti O Nisheti, Mahashweta Devi takes up the narrative from where the Mahabharata ends it. She sets the story in a forest, where Kunti retires after the war. Kunti now has time to reflect on her past, and often confesses to what she regards as her failings, talking with the earth, the symbol of nature. Every day she sees the Nishadas who come to collect wood, honey, tubers, and roots. One Nisheti, a Nisheta woman, often listens to Kunti when she talks with the earth. One day, there was something in the air, the animals were fleeing the forest. Kunti noticed that the Nisheti was watching her, and was startled when she spoke to her and asked if she remembered the house of lac. Yes, Kunti said, she did. Did she remember a certain elderly Nisheti and her 5 young sons? And that she had served them wine till they were senseless, while she escaped with her own sons. That Nisheti? Not you! Kunti exclaimed. The Nisheti replied that the woman who was killed had been her mother-in-law. She added that while Kunti had been reflecting on her past, not once did she remember the 6 innocent lives that were lost because she had wanted to save herself and her sons. As they spoke, the flames drew nearer. The Nisheti escaped to safety, but Kunti remained where she was. Timeline 1. Major textual traditions. c. 500 BCE Ashtadhyayi of Panini, a work on Sanskrit grammar. c. 500 to 200 BCE Major Dharma Sutras, in Sanskrit. c. 500 to 100 BCE Early Buddhist texts including the Tripitaka, in Pali. c. 500 BCE To 400 CE Ramayana and Mahabharata, in Sanskrit. c. 200 BCE To 200 CE Manusmriti, in Sanskrit, composition and compilation of Tamil Sangam literature. c. 100 CE Sharaka and Sushruta Samhitas, works on medicine. In Sanskrit. c. 200 CE onwards compilation of the Puranas, in Sanskrit. c. 300 CE 5 Shastra of Bharata, a work on dramaturgy. In Sanskrit. c. 300 to 600 CE other Dharma Shastras, in Sanskrit. c. 400 to 500 CE Sanskrit plays including the works of Kalidasa. Works on astronomy and mathematics by Aryabhata and Varahamihira, in Sanskrit, compilation of Jaina works, in Prakrit. Timeline 2. Major landmarks in the study of the Mahabharata. 20th century. 1919 to 1966 preparation and publication of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. 1973 J.A.B. Van Beetenen begins English translation of the critical edition, remains incomplete after his death in 1978. Patrilineal means tracing descent from father to son, grandson, and so on. Matrilineal is the term used when descent is traced through the mother. Terms for family and kin. Sanskrit texts use the term kula to designate families and janatai for the larger network of kinfolk. The term Vamsha is used for lineage. Source 1. Producing fine sons. Here is an excerpt of a mantra from the Rigveda, which was probably inserted in the text c. 1000 BCE, to be chanted by the priest while conducting the marriage ritual. It is used in many Hindu weddings even today. I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love. Indra was one of the principal deities, a god of valor, warfare, and rain. Here and there refer to the father's and husband's house respectively. Source 2. Why kinfolk quarreled. This is an excerpt from the Adi Parvan, literally, the first section, of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, describing why conflicts arose amongst the Kauravas and Pandavas. The Kauravas were the sons of Dhritarashtra, and the Pandavas were their cousins. Since Dhritarashtra was blind, his younger brother Pandu ascended the throne of Hastinapura. However, after the premature death of Pandu, Dhritarashtra became king, as the royal princes were still very young. As the princes grew up together, the citizens of Hastinapura began to express their preference for the Pandavas, for they were more capable and virtuous than the Kauravas. This made Duryodhana, the eldest of the Kauravas, jealous. He approached his father and said, "You yourself did not receive the throne, although it fell to you, because of your defect. If the Pandava receives the patrimony from Pandu, his son will surely inherit it in turn, and so will his son, and his. We ourselves with our sons shall be excluded from the royal succession and become of slight regard in the eyes of the world, Lord of the earth." Passages such as these may not have been literally true, but they give us an idea about what those who wrote the text thought. Sometimes, as in this case, they contain conflicting ideas. Source 3. 8 Forms of Marriage. Here are the first, fourth, fifth, and sixth forms of marriage from the Manusmriti. First, the gift of a daughter, after dressing her in costly clothes and honoring her with presents of jewels, to a man learned in the Veda whom the father himself invites. Fourth, the gift of a daughter by the father after he has addressed the couple with the text, "May both of you perform your duties together," and has shown honor to the bridegroom. Fifth, when the bridegroom receives a maiden, after having given as much wealth as he can afford to the kinsman and to the bride herself, according to his own will. Sixth, the voluntary union of a maiden and her lover, which springs from desire. Source 4. Aims of Satavahana Kings from inscriptions. These are the names of several generations of Satavahana rulers, recovered from inscriptions. Note the uniform title Raja. Also note the following word, which ends with the term Puta, a Prakrit word meaning son. The term Gautamiputta means son of Gautami. Names like Gautami and Vasuthi are feminine forms of Gautama and Vasistha, Vedic seers after whom Gotras were named. Raja Gautamiputta Siri Se Takani. Raja Vasithiputta, Sami, Siri Pulame I Raja Gautamiputta Sami Zirayane Zatakani Raja Madharaputta Svami Sake Sina. Raja Vasithiputta Shatarapana Se Takani. Raja Haratiputta Vinhyakata Shatakulanam Da Se Takamni Raja Gautamiputta Siri Vijaya Sadakani. Source 5. A Mother's Advice. The Mahabharata describes how, when war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas became almost inevitable, Gandhari made one last appeal to her eldest son Duryodhana. "By making peace you honor your father and me, as well as your well-wishers. It is the wise man in control of his senses who guards his kingdom. Greed and anger drag a man away from his profits. By defeating these two enemies a king conquers the earth. You will happily enjoy the earth, my son, along with the wise and heroic Pandavas. There is no good in a war, no law, dharma, and profit, artha, let alone happiness. Nor is there, necessarily, victory in the end. Do not set your mind on war." Duryodhana did not listen to this advice and fought and lost the war. Metronymics in the Upanishads. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, contains a list of successive generations of teachers and students, many of whom were designated by metronymics. Source 6. A divine order. To justify their claims, Brahmanas often cited a verse from a hymn in the Rigveda known as the Purusa Supa, describing the sacrifice of Purusha, the primeval man. All the elements of the universe, including the 4 social categories, were supposed to have emanated from his body. The Brahmana was his mouth, of his arms was made the Kshatriya. His thighs became the Vaishya, of his feet the Shudra was born. Source 7. Proper social roles. Here is a story from the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. Once Drona, a Brahmana who taught archery to the Kuru princes, was approached by Ekalavya, a forest-dwelling Nisheda, a hunting community. When Drona, who knew the Dharma, refused to have him as his pupil, Ekalavya returned to the forest, prepared an image of Drona out of clay, and treating it as his teacher, began to practice on his own. In due course, he acquired great skill in archery. One day, the Kuru princes went hunting and their dog, wandering in the woods, came upon Ekalavya. When the dog smelt the dark Nisheda wrapped in black deer skin, his body caked with dirt, it began to bark. Annoyed, Ekalavya shot 7 arrows into its mouth. When the dog returned to the Pandavas, they were amazed at this superb display of archery. They tracked down Ekalavya, who introduced himself as a pupil of Drona. Drona had once told his favorite student Arjuna, that he would be unrivaled amongst his pupils. Arjuna now reminded Drona about this. Drona approached Ekalavya, who immediately acknowledged and honored him as his teacher. When Drona demanded his right thumb as his fee, Ekalavya unhesitatingly cut it off and offered it. But thereafter, when he shot with his remaining fingers, he was no longer as fast as he had been before. Thus, Drona kept his word, no one was better than Arjuna. Source 8. What the Silkweavers did. Here is an excerpt from the inscription, which is in Sanskrit. Some are intensely attached to music, so, pleasing to the ear, others, being proud of, the authorship of, 100 excellent biographies, are conversant with wonderful tales, others, filled with humility, are absorbed in excellent religious discourses, some excel in their own religious rites, likewise by others, who were self-possessed, the science of, Vedic, astronomy was mastered, and others, valorous in battle, even today forcibly cause harm to the enemies. Source 9. A Tigerlike Husband. This is a summary of a story from the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. The Pandavas had fled into the forest. They were tired and fell asleep. Only Bhima, the second Pandava, renowned for his prowess, was keeping watch. A emanating Rakshasa caught the scent of the Pandavas and sent his sister Hidimba to capture them. She fell in love with Bhima, transformed herself into a lovely maiden and proposed to him. He refused. Meanwhile, the Rakshasa arrived and challenged Bhima to a wrestling match. Bhima accepted the challenge and killed him. The others woke up hearing the noise. Hidimba introduced herself, and declared her love for Bhima. She told Kunti, I have forsaken my friends, my dharma, and my kin, and good lady, chosen your tiger-like son for my man, whether you think me a fool, or your devoted servant, let me join you, great lady, with your son as my husband. Ultimately, Yudhisthira agreed to the marriage on condition that they would spend the day together but that Bhima would return every night. The couple roamed all over the world during the day. In due course Hidimba gave birth to a Rakshasa boy named Gatotkaca. Then the mother and son left the Pandavas. Gatotkaca promised to return to the Pandavas whenever they needed him. Some historians suggest that the term Rakshasa is used to describe people whose practices differed from those laid down in Brahmanical texts. Source 10. The Bodhisattva as a Chandala. Did Chandalas resist the attempts to push them to the bottom of the social order? Read this story, which is part of the Matanga Jataka, a Pali text, where the Bodhisattva, the Buddha in a previous birth, is identified as a Chandala. Once, the Bodhisattva was born outside the city of Benares as a Chandala's son and named Matanga. One day, when he had gone to the city on some work, he encountered Ditha Mangalika, the daughter of a merchant. When she saw him, she exclaimed, I have seen something inauspicious, and washed her eyes. The angry Hangerson then beat him up. In protest, he went and lay down at the door of her father's house. On the 7th day they brought out the girl and gave her to him. She carried the starving Matanga back to the Chandala settlement. Once he returned home, he decided to renounce the world. After attaining spiritual powers, he returned to Benares and married her. A son named Mandavya Kumara was born to them. He learnt the 3 Vedas as he grew up and began to provide food to 16,000 brahmanas every day. One day, Matanga, dressed in rags, with a clay alms bowl in his hand, arrived at his son's doorstep and begged for food. Mandavya replied that he looked like an outcast and was unworthy of alms, the food was meant for the brahmanas. Matanga said, "Those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings." Mandavya lost his temper and asked his servants to throw the man out. Matanga rose in the air and disappeared. When Dithamangalika learnt about the incident, she followed Matanga and begged his forgiveness. He asked her to take a bit of the leftover from his bowl and give it to Mandavya and the brahmanas. Source 11. Draupadi's question. Draupadi is supposed to have asked Yudhisthira whether he had lost himself before staking her. 2 contrary opinions were expressed in response to this question. 1. That even if Yudhisthira had lost himself earlier, his wife remained under his control, so he could stake her. 2. That an unfree man, as Yudhisthira was when he had lost himself, could not stake another person. The matter remained unresolved. Ultimately, Dhritarashtra restored to the Pandavas and Draupadi their personal freedom. Source 12. How could men and women acquire wealth? For men, the Manusmriti declares, there are 7 means of acquiring wealth: inheritance, finding, purchase, conquest, investment, work, and acceptance of gifts from good people. For women, there are 6 means of acquiring wealth: what was given in front of the fire, marriage, or the bridal procession, or as a token of affection, and what she got from her brother, mother, or father. She could also acquire wealth through any subsequent gift and whatever her affectionate husband might give her. Source 13. The Wealthy Shudra. This story, based on a Buddhist text in Pali known as the Majjhima Nikaya, is part of a dialogue between a king named Avantaputa and a disciple of the Buddha named Kachchana. While it may not be literally true, it reveals Buddhist attitudes towards Varna. Avantaputa asked Kachchana what he thought about Brahmanas who held that they were the best caste and that all other castes were low, that Brahmanas were a fair caste while all other castes were dark, that only Brahmanas were pure, not non-Brahmanas, that Brahmanas were sons of Brahma, born of his mouth, born of Brahma, formed by Brahma, heirs to Brahma. Kachchana replied, what if a Shudra were wealthy? Would another Shudra, or a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya, speak politely to him? Avantaputa replied that if a Shudra had wealth or corn or gold or silver, he could have as his obedient servant another Shudra to get up earlier than he, to go to rest later, to carry out his orders, to speak politely, or he could even have a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya as his obedient servant. Kachchana asked, this being so, are not these 4 Varnas exactly the same? Avantaputa conceded that there was no difference amongst the Varnas on this count. Source 14. The Poor Generous Chief. In this composition from the Puranaruru, one of the anthologies of poems of the Tamil Sangam literature, c. 1st century CE, a bard describes his patron to other poets thus. He, i.e. the patron, does not have the wealth to lavish on others every day. Nor does he have the pettiness to say that he has nothing and so refuse. He lives in Irantai, a place, and is generous. He is an enemy to the hunger of bards. If you wish to cure your poverty, come along with me, bards whose lips are so skilled. If we request him, showing him our ribs thin with hunger, he will go to the blacksmith of his village. And will say to that man of powerful hands, shape me a long spear for war, one that has a straight blade. What are the strategies which the bard uses to try and persuade the chief to be generous? What is the chief expected to do to acquire wealth in order to give some to the bards? Didactic refers to something that is meant for purposes of instruction. Source 15. Hastinapura. This is how the city is described in the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. The city, bursting like the ocean, packed with hundreds of mansions, displayed with its gateways, arches, and turrets like massing clouds the splendor of great Indra's city. Source 16. Draupadi's marriage. Drupada, the king of Panchala, organized a competition where the challenge was to string a bow and hit a target. The winner would be chosen to marry his daughter Draupadi. Arjuna was victorious and was garlanded by Draupadi. The Pandavas returned with her to their mother Kunti, who, even before she saw them, asked them to share whatever they had got. She realized her mistake when she saw Draupadi, but her command could not be violated. After much deliberation, Yudhisthira decided that Draupadi would be their common wife. When Drupada was told about this, he protested. However, the seer Vyasa arrived and told him that the Pandavas were in reality incarnations of Indra, whose wife had been reborn as Draupadi, and they were thus destined for each other. Vyasa added that in another instance a young woman had prayed to Shiva for a husband, and in her enthusiasm, had prayed 5 times instead of once. This woman was now reborn as Draupadi, and Shiva had fulfilled her prayers. Convinced by these stories, Drupada consented to the marriage. Types of marriages. Endogamy refers to marriage within a unit. This could be a kin group, caste, or a group living in the same locality. Exogamy refers to marriage outside the unit. Polygyny is the practice of a man having several wives. Polyandry is the practice of a woman having several husbands. Theme thinkers, beliefs, and buildings. Cultural developments. 4. c. 600 BCE 600 CE. In this chapter we shall go on a long journey across 1,000 years to read about philosophers and their attempts to understand the world they inhabited. We will also see how their ideas were compiled as oral and written texts as well as expressed in architecture and sculpture. These are indicative of the enduring influence these thinkers had on people. While we will be focusing on Buddhism, it is important to remember that this tradition did not develop in isolation. There were several other traditions, each engaged in debates and dialogues with the others. The sources that historians use to reconstruct this exciting world of ideas and beliefs include Buddhist, Jaina, and Brahmanical texts, as well as a large and impressive body of material remains including monuments and inscriptions. Among the best preserved monuments of the time is the stupa at Sanchi, which is a major focus in this chapter. 19th century Europeans were very interested in the stupa at Sanchi. In fact, the French sought Shah Jahan Begum's permission to take away the eastern gateway, which was the best preserved, to be displayed in a museum in France. For a while some Englishmen also wanted to do the same, but fortunately both the French and the English were satisfied with carefully prepared plaster cast copies, and the original remained at the site, part of the Bhopal state. The rulers of Bhopal, Shah Jahan Begum and her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, provided money for the preservation of the ancient site. No wonder then that John Marshall dedicated his important volumes on Sanchi to Sultan Jahan. She funded the museum that was built there as well as the guest house where he lived and wrote the volumes. She also funded the publication of the volumes. So if the stupa complex has survived, it is in no small measure due to wise decisions, and to good luck in escaping the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and those looking for finds to carry away to the museums of Europe. One of the most important Buddhist centers, the discovery of Sanchi has vastly transformed our understanding of early Buddhism. Today it stands testimony to the successful restoration and preservation of a key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. But what is the significance of this monument? Why was the mound built and what did it contain? Why is there a stone railing around it? Who built the complex or paid for its construction? When was it discovered? There is a fascinating story that we can uncover at Sanchi, for which we must combine information from texts, sculpture, architecture, and inscriptions. Let us begin by exploring the background of the early Buddhist tradition. 2. The background. Sacrifices and debates. The mid-first millennium BCE is often regarded as a turning point in world history. It saw the emergence of thinkers such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavira and Gautama Buddha, among many others, in India. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. This was also the time when new kingdoms and cities were developing and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in the Ganga Valley. These thinkers attempted to understand these developments as well. 2.1 The sacrificial tradition. There were several pre-existing traditions of thought, religious belief, and practice, including the early Vedic tradition, known from the Rigveda, compiled between c. 1500 and 1000 BCE. The Rigveda consists of hymns in praise of a variety of deities, especially Agni, Indra, and Soma. Many of these hymns were chanted when sacrifices were performed, where people prayed for cattle, sons, good health, long life, etc. At first, sacrifices were performed collectively. Later, c. 1000 BCE to 500 BCE onwards, some were performed by the heads of households for the well-being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices, such as the Rajaswiya and Ashvamedha, were performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmana priests to conduct the ritual. 2.2 EU questions. Many ideas found in the Upanishads, c. 6th century BCE onwards, show that people were curious about the meaning of life, the possibility of life after death, and rebirth. Was rebirth due to past actions? Such issues were hotly debated. Thinkers were concerned with understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality. And others, outside the Vedic tradition, asked whether or not there even was a single ultimate reality. People also began speculating on the significance of the sacrificial tradition. 2.3 Debates and discussions. We get a glimpse of lively discussions and debates from Buddhist texts, which mention as many as 64 sects or schools of thought. Teachers traveled from place to place, trying to convince one another as well as lay persons, about the validity of their philosophy or the way they understood the world. Debates took place in the Kudagara Shala, literally, a hut with a pointed roof, or in groves where traveling mendicants halted. If a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, the followers of the latter also became his disciples. So support for any particular sect could grow and shrink over time. Many of these teachers, including Mahavira and the Buddha, questioned the authority of the Vedas. They also emphasized individual agency, suggesting that men and women could strive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. This was in marked contrast to the Brahmanical position, wherein, as we have seen, an individual's existence was thought to be determined by his or her birth in a specific caste or gender. 3. Beyond worldly pleasures. The message of Mahavira. The basic philosophy of the Jainas was already in existence in North India before the birth of Vardhamana, who came to be known as Mahavira, in the 6th century BCE. According to Jaina tradition, Mahavira was preceded by 23 other teachers, or Tirthankaras, literally, those who guide men and women across the river of existence. The most important idea in Jainism is that the entire world is animated, even stones, rocks, and water have life. Non-injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects, is central to Jaina philosophy. In fact, the principle of ahimsa, emphasized within Jainism, has left its mark on Indian thinking as a whole. According to Jaina teachings, the cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped through karma. Asceticism and penance are required to free oneself from the cycle of karma. This can be achieved only by renouncing the world, therefore, monastic existence is a necessary condition of salvation. Jaina monks and nuns took 5 vows: to abstain from killing, stealing and lying, to observe celibacy, and to abstain from possessing property. 3.1 The spread of Jainism. Gradually, Jainism spread to many parts of India. Like the Buddhists, Jaina scholars produced a wealth of literature in a variety of languages: Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Tamil. For centuries, manuscripts of these texts were carefully preserved in libraries attached to temples. Some of the earliest stone sculptures associated with religious traditions were produced by devotees of the Jaina Tirthankaras, and have been recovered from several sites throughout the subcontinent. 4. The Buddha and the Quest for Enlightenment. One of the most influential teachers of the time was the Buddha. Over the centuries, his message spread across the subcontinent and beyond through Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan, and through Sri Lanka, across the seas to Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. How do we know about the Buddha's teachings? These have been reconstructed by carefully editing, translating, and analyzing the Buddhist texts mentioned earlier. Historians have also tried to reconstruct details of his life from hagiographies. Many of these were written down at least a century after the time of the Buddha, in an attempt to preserve memories of the great teacher. According to these traditions, Siddhartha, as the Buddha was named at birth, was the son of a chief of the Sakya clan. He had a sheltered upbringing within the palace, insulated from the harsh realities of life. One day he persuaded his charioteer to take him into the city. His first journey into the world outside was traumatic. He was deeply anguished when he saw an old man, a sick man and a corpse. He realized in that moment that the decay and destruction of the human body was inevitable. He also saw a homeless mendicant, who, it seemed to him, had come to terms with old age, disease, and death, and found peace. Siddhartha decided that he too would adopt the same path. Soon after, he left the palace and set out in search of his own truth. Siddhartha explored several paths including bodily mortification which led him to a situation of near death. Abandoning these extreme methods, he meditated for several days and finally attained enlightenment. After this he came to be known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. For the rest of his life, he taught Dhamma or the path of righteous living. 5. The teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha's teachings have been reconstructed from stories, found mainly in the Sutta Pitaka. Although some stories describe his miraculous powers, others suggest that the Buddha tried to convince people through reason and persuasion rather than through displays of supernatural power. For instance, when a grief-stricken woman whose child had died came to the Buddha, he gently convinced her about the inevitability of death rather than bring her son back to life. These stories were narrated in the language spoken by ordinary people so that these could be easily understood. According to Buddhist philosophy, the world is transient, anicca, and constantly changing. It is also soulless, anatta, as there is nothing permanent or eternal in it. Within this transient world, sorrow, dukkha, is intrinsic to human existence. It is by following the path of moderation between severe penance and self-indulgence that human beings can rise above these worldly troubles. In the earliest forms of Buddhism, whether or not God existed was irrelevant. The Buddha regarded the social world as the creation of humans rather than of divine origin. Therefore, he advised kings and Gahapatis to be humane and ethical. Individual effort was expected to transform social relations. The Buddha emphasized individual agency and righteous action as the means to escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self-realization and nibbana, literally the extinguishing of the ego and desire, and thus end the cycle of suffering for those who renounced the world. According to Buddhist tradition, his last words to his followers were, "Be lamps unto yourselves as all of you must work out your own liberation." 6. Followers of the Buddha. Soon there grew a body of disciples of the Buddha and he founded a Sangha, an organization of monks who too became teachers of Dhamma. These monks lived simply, possessing only the essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food once a day from the laity. As they lived on alms, they were known as bhikkhus. Initially, only men were allowed into the Sangha, but later women also came to be admitted. According to Buddhist texts, this was made possible through the mediation of Ananda, one of the Buddha's dearest disciples, who persuaded him to allow women into the Sangha. The Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautama, was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. Many women who entered the Sangha became teachers of Dhamma and went on to become theris, or respected women who had attained liberation. The Buddha's followers came from many social groups. They included kings, wealthy men, and Gahapatis, and also humbler folk, workers, slaves, and craftspeople. Once within the Sangha, all were regarded as equal, having shed their earlier social identities on becoming bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The internal functioning of the Sangha was based on the traditions of Ganas and Sanghas, where consensus was arrived at through discussions. If that failed, decisions were taken by a vote on the subject. Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death, as it appealed to many people dissatisfied with existing religious practices and confused by the rapid social changes taking place around them. The importance attached to conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth, the emphasis placed on metta, fellow feeling, and karuna, compassion, especially for those who were younger and weaker than oneself, were ideas that drew men and women to Buddhist teachings. 7. Stupas. We have seen that Buddhist ideas and practices emerged out of a process of dialogue with other traditions including those of the Brahmanas, Jainas, and several others, not all of whose ideas and practices were preserved in texts. Some of these interactions can be seen in the ways in which sacred places came to be identified. From earliest times, people tended to regard certain places as sacred. These included sites with special trees or unique rocks, or sites of awe-inspiring natural beauty. These sites, with small shrines attached to them, were sometimes described as chaitayas. Buddhist literature mentions several chaitayas. It also describes places associated with the Buddha's life where he was born, Lumbini, where he attained enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon, Sarnath, and where he attained Nibbana, Kusinagara. Gradually, each of these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Asoka erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he had visited the place. 7.1 Why were stupas built? There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. This was because relics of the Buddha such as his bodily remains or objects used by him were buried there. These were mounds known as stupas. The tradition of erecting stupas may have been pre-Buddhist, but they came to be associated with Buddhism. Since they contained relics regarded as sacred, the entire stupa came to be venerated as an emblem of both the Buddha and Buddhism. According to a Buddhist text known as the Ashokavadana, Asoka distributed portions of the Buddha's relics to every important town and ordered the construction of stupas over them. By the 2nd century BCE a number of stupas, including those at Bharhut, Sanchi, and Sarnath, had been built. 7.2 How were stupas built? Inscriptions found on the railings and pillars of stupas record donations made for building and decorating them. Some donations were made by kings such as the Satavahanas, others were made by guilds, such as that of the ivory workers who financed part of one of the gateways at Sanchi. Hundreds of donations were made by women and men who mention their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they came, as well as their occupations and names of their relatives. Bhikkhus and bhikkhunis also contributed towards building these monuments. 7.3 The structure of the stupa. The stupa, a Sanskrit word meaning a heap, originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called anda. Gradually, it evolved into a more complex structure, balancing round and square shapes. Above the anda was the harmika, a balcony-like structure that represented the abode of the gods. Arising from the harmika was a mast called the yashti, often surmounted by a chhatri or umbrella. Around the mound was a railing, separating the sacred space from the secular world. The early stupas at Sanchi and Bharhut were plain except for the stone railings, which resembled a bamboo or wooden fence, and the gateways, which were richly carved and installed at the 4 cardinal points. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mound in a clockwise direction, keeping the mound on the right, imitating the sun's course through the sky. Later, the mound of the stupas came to be elaborately carved with niches and sculptures as at Amaravati, and Shahjagadhiri in Peshawar, Pakistan. 8. Discovering stupas. The fate of Amaravati and Sanchi. Each stupa has a history of its own as we have just seen. Some of these are histories of how they were built. But there are histories of discoveries as well, and let us now turn to some of these. In 1796, a local Raja who wanted to build a temple stumbled upon the ruins of the stupa at Amaravati. He decided to use the stone, and thought there might be some treasure buried in what seemed to be a hill. Some years later, a British official named Colin Mackenzie visited the site. Although he found several pieces of sculpture and made detailed drawings of them, these reports were never published. In 1854, Walter Elliot, the Commissioner of Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, visited Amaravati and collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras. These came to be called the Elliot marbles after him. He also discovered the remains of the Western Gateway and came to the conclusion that the structure at Amaravati was one of the largest and most magnificent Buddhist stupas ever built. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amaravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the India Office in Madras, and some even to London. It was not unusual to find these sculptures adorning the gardens of British administrators. In fact, any new official in the area continued to remove sculptures from the site on the grounds that earlier officials had done the same. One of the few men who had a different point of view was an archaeologist named H. Cole. He wrote, "It seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art." He believed that museums should have plaster-cast facsimiles of sculpture, whereas the originals should remain where they had been found. Unfortunately, Cole did not succeed in convincing the authorities about Amaravati, although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sanchi. Why did Sanchi survive while Amaravati did not? Perhaps Amaravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. When Sanchi was discovered in 1818, 3 of its 4 gateways were still standing, the 4th was lying on the spot where it had fallen and the mound was in good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway be taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sanchi as it was, and so it stands, whereas the Mahachitya at Amaravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. 9. Sculpture. We have just seen how sculptures were removed from stupas and transported all the way to Europe. This happened partly because those who saw them considered them to be beautiful and valuable, and wanted to keep them for themselves. Let us look at some of these more closely. 9.1 Stories in Stone. You may have seen wandering storytellers carrying scrolls, karanachitras, of cloth or paper with pictures on them and pointing to the pictures as they tell the story. Look at figure 4.13. At first sight the sculpture seems to depict a rural scene, with thatched huts and trees. However, art historians who have carefully studied the sculpture at Sanchi identify it as a scene from the Vesantara Jataka. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to a Brahmana, and went to live in the forest with his wife and children. As you can see in this case, historians often try to understand the meaning of sculpture by comparing it with textual evidence. 9.2 Symbols of Worship. Art historians had to acquire familiarity with hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand Buddhist sculpture. According to hagiographies, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree. Many early sculptors did not show the Buddha in human form. Instead, they showed his presence through symbols. The empty seat was meant to indicate the meditation of the Buddha, and the stupa was meant to represent the Mahaparinibbana. Another frequently used symbol was the wheel. This stood for the first sermon of the Buddha, delivered at Sarnath. As is obvious, such sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand simply for a tree, but symbolizes an event in the life of the Buddha. In order to understand such symbols, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produced these works of art. 9.3 Popular traditions. Other sculptures at Sanchi were perhaps not directly inspired by Buddhist ideas. These include beautiful women swinging from the edge of the gateway, holding onto a tree. Initially, scholars were a bit intrigued about this image, which seemed to have little to do with renunciation. However, after examining other literary traditions, they realized that it could be a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as a Shalabhanjika. According to popular belief, this was a woman whose touch caused trees to flower and bear fruit. It is likely that this was regarded as an auspicious symbol and integrated into the decoration of the stupa. The Shalabhanjika motif suggests that many people who turned to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist beliefs, practices, and ideas. Some of the recurrent motifs in the sculpture at Sanchi were evidently derived from these traditions. There are other images as well. For instance, some of the finest depictions of animals are found there. These animals include elephants, horses, monkeys, and cattle. While the Jatakas contain several animal stories that are depicted at Sanchi, it is likely that many of these animals were carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers. Also, animals were often used as symbols of human attributes. Elephants, for example, were depicted to signify strength and wisdom. Paintings from the past. While stone sculpture survives the ravages of time and is therefore most easily available to the historian, other visual means of communication, including paintings, were also used in the past. Those that have survived best are on walls of caves, of which those from Ajunta, Maharashtra, are the most famous. The paintings at Ajunta depict stories from the Jatakas. These include depictions of courtly life, processions, men and women at work, and festivals. The artists used the technique of shading to give a three-dimensional quality. Some of the paintings are extremely naturalistic. Another motif is that of a woman surrounded by lotuses and elephants, which seem to be sprinkling water on her as if performing an abhisheka or consecration. While some historians identify the figure as Maya, the mother of the Buddha, others identify her with a popular goddess, Gajalakshmi, literally, the goddess of good fortune, who is associated with elephants. It is also possible that devotees who saw these sculptures identified the figure with both Maya and Gajalakshmi. Consider, too, the serpent, which is found on several pillars. This motif seems to be derived from popular traditions, which were not always recorded in texts. Interestingly, one of the earliest modern art historians, James Ferguson, considered Sanchi to be a center of tree and serpent worship. He was not familiar with Buddhist literature, most of which had not yet been translated, and arrived at this conclusion by studying only the images on their own. 10. New religious traditions. 10.1 The development of Mahayana Buddhism. By the 1st century CE, there is evidence of changes in Buddhist ideas and practices. Early Buddhist teachings had given great importance to self-effort in achieving nibbana. Besides, the Buddha was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and nibbana through his own efforts. However, gradually the idea of a savior emerged. It was believed that he was the one who could ensure salvation. Simultaneously, the concept of the Bodhisattva also developed. Bodhisattvas were perceived as deeply compassionate beings who accumulated merit through their efforts but used this not to attain nibbana and thereby abandon the world, but to help others. The worship of images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally, the great vehicle. Those who adopted these beliefs described the older tradition as Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle. 10.2 The growth of Puranic Hinduism. The notion of a savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within traditions that we now consider part of Hinduism. These included Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as the principal deity, and Shaivism, a tradition within which Shiva was regarded as the chief god, in which there was growing emphasis on the worship of a chosen deity. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one of love and devotion, or bhakti. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults developed around the various avatars or incarnations of the deity. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. These were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever it was threatened by disorder and destruction because of the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of Vishnu was one way of creating a more unified religious tradition. Some of these forms were represented in sculptures, as were other deities. Shiva, for instance, was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in human form too. All such representations depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributes through symbols such as headdresses, ornaments, and ayudas, weapons or auspicious objects the deities hold in their hands, how they are seated, etc. To understand the meanings of these sculptures, historians have to be familiar with the stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Puranas, compiled by Brahmanas, by about the middle of the first millennium CE. They contained much that had been composed and been in circulation for centuries, including stories about gods and goddesses. Generally, they were written in simple Sanskrit verse, and were meant to be read aloud to everybody, including women and Shudras, who did not have access to Vedic learning. Much of what is contained in the Puranas evolved through interaction amongst people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who traveled from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. We know, for instance, that Vasudeva Krishna was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his worship spread to other parts of the country as well. 10.3 Building temples. Around the time that the stupas at sites such as Sanchi were acquiring their present form, the first temples to house images of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temple was a small square room, called the Garbhagriha, with a single doorway for the worshipper to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure, known as the Shikhara, was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculpture. Later temples became far more elaborate, with assembly halls, huge walls, and gateways, and arrangements for supplying water. One of the unique features of early temples was that some of these were hollowed out of huge rocks, as artificial caves. The tradition of building artificial caves was an old one. Some of the earliest of these were constructed in the 3rd century BCE on the orders of Asoka for renouncers who belonged to the Ajivaka sect. This tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving out of an entire temple, that of Kailashnatha, a name of Shiva. A copperplate inscription records the amazement of the chief sculptor after he completed the temple at Ellora. Oh, how did I make it? 11. Can we see everything? By now you have had a glimpse of the rich visual traditions that existed in the past, expressed in brick and stone architecture, sculpture, and painting. We have seen that much has been destroyed and lost over the centuries. Nevertheless, what remains and has been preserved conveys a sense of the vision of the artists, sculptors, masons, and architects who created these spectacular works. Yet, do we always automatically understand what they wanted to convey? Can we ever know what these images meant to people who saw them and venerated them about 2,000 years ago? 11.1 Grappling with the unfamiliar. It will be useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars first saw some of the sculptures of gods and goddesses, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes, they were horrified by what seemed to them grotesque figures, with multiple arms and heads or with combinations of human and animal forms. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with sculpture with which they were familiar, that from ancient Greece. While they often found early Indian sculpture inferior to the works of Greek artists, they were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were evidently based on Greek models. These were, more often than not, found in the northwest, in cities such as Taxila and Peshawar, where Indo-Greek rulers had established kingdoms. In the 2nd century BCE, as these images were closest to the Greek statues these scholars were familiar with, they were considered to be the best examples of early Indian art. In effect, these scholars adopted a strategy we all frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. 11.2 If text and image do not match. Consider another problem. We have seen that art historians often draw upon textual traditions to understand the meaning of sculptures. While this is certainly a far more efficacious strategy than comparing Indian images with Greek statues, it is not always easy to use. One of the most intriguing examples of this is a famous sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu. Clearly, Figure 4.30 is a vivid depiction of a story. But which story is it? Art historians have searched through the Puranas to identify it and are sharply divided in their opinions. Some feel that this depicts the descent of the river Ganga from heaven. The natural cleft through the center of the rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Puranas and the epics. Others feel that it represents a story from the Mahabharata, Arjuna doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire arms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Finally, remember that many rituals, religious beliefs, and practices were not recorded in a permanent, visible form as monuments, or sculpture, or even paintings. These included daily practices, as well as those associated with special occasions. Many communities and peoples may not have felt the need for keeping lasting records, even as they may have had vibrant traditions of religious activities and philosophical ideas. In fact, the spectacular instances we have focused on in this chapter are just the tip of the iceberg. Timeline 1. Major religious developments. c. 1500 to 1000 BCE Early Vedic traditions. c. 1000 to 500 BCE Later Vedic traditions. c. 6th century BCE Early Upanishads, Jainism, Buddhism. c. 3rd century BCE First Stupas. c. 2nd century development of Mahayana Buddhism, Vaishnavism. BCE onwards Shaivism and goddess cults. c. 3rd century CE Earliest temples. Timeline 2. Landmarks in the discovery and preservation of early monuments and sculpture. 18th century. 1814 Founding of the Indian Museum, Calcutta. 1834 Publication of Essay on the Architecture of the Hindus. By Ram Raja, Cunningham explores the stupa at Sarnath. 1835 to 1842 James Ferguson surveys major archaeological sites. 1851 Establishment of the Government Museum, Madras. 1854 Alexander Cunningham publishes Purusa Supa, one of the earliest works on Sanchi. 1878 Rajendra Lala Mitra publishes Buddha Gaya, the heritage of Sakya Muni. 1880 H. Cole appointed curator of ancient monuments. 1888 Passing of the Treasure Trove Act, giving the government the right to acquire all objects of archaeological interest. 20th century. 1914 John Marshall and Alfred Fowker publish the Monuments of Sanchi. 1923 John Marshall publishes the Conservation Manual. 1955 Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru lays the foundation stone of the National Museum, New Delhi. 1989 Sanchi declared a World Heritage Site. 1. A glimpse of Sanchi. Sanchi in the 19th century. The most wonderful ancient buildings in the state of Bhopal are at Sanchi Kanakira, a small village under the brow of a hill some 20 miles northeast of Bhopal, which we visited yesterday. We inspected the stone sculptures and statues of the Buddha and an ancient gateway. The ruins appear to be the object of great interest to European gentlemen. Major Alexander Cunningham stayed several weeks in this neighborhood and examined these ruins most carefully. He took drawings of the place, deciphered the inscription, and bored shafts down these domes. The results of his investigations were described by him in an English work. From Shah Jahan Begum, Nawab of Bhopal, ruled 1868 to 1901. Taj-ul Iqbal Tariq Bhopal, A History of Bhopal, translated by H.D. Barstow, 1876. Figure 4.3. The Great Stupa at Sanchi. If you travel from Delhi to Bhopal by train, you will see the majestic stupa complex on top of a hill, crowning it as it were. If you request the guard, he will stop the train at the little station of Sanchi for 2 minutes, enough time for you to get down. As you climb up the hill, you can see the complex of structures, a large mound and other monuments including a temple built in the 5th century. Source 1. A Prayer to Agni. Here are 2 verses from the Rigveda invoking Agni, the god of fire, often identified with the sacrificial fire, into which offerings were made so as to reach the other deities. Bring, O strong one, this sacrifice of ours to the gods, O wise one, as a liberal giver. Bestow on us, O priest, abundant food. Agni, obtain, by sacrificing, mighty wealth for us. Procure, O Agni, forever to him who prays to you, the gift of nourishment, the wonderful cow. May a son be ours, offspring that continues our line. Verses such as these were composed in a special kind of Sanskrit, known as Vedic Sanskrit. They were taught orally to men belonging to priestly families. Source 2. Verses from the Upanishads. Here are 2 verses from the Chandogya Upanishad, a text composed in Sanskrit c. 6th century BCE. The nature of the self. This self of mine within the heart, is smaller than paddy or barley or mustard or millet or the kernel of a seed of millet. This self of mine within the heart is greater than the earth, greater than the intermediate space, greater than heaven, greater than these worlds. The true sacrifice. This one, the wind, that blows, this is surely a sacrifice. While moving, it sanctifies all this, therefore it is indeed a sacrifice. How Buddhist texts were prepared and preserved. The Buddha, and other teachers, taught orally through discussion and debate. Men and women, perhaps children as well, attended these discourses and discussed what they heard. None of the Buddha's speeches were written down during his lifetime. After his death, c. 5th-4th century BCE, his teachings were compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or senior monks at Vaisali, Pali for Vaishali in present-day Bihar. These compilations were known as Tipitaka, literally, 3 baskets to hold different types of texts. They were first transmitted orally and then written and classified according to length as well as subject matter. The Vinaya Pitaka included rules and regulations for those who joined the Sangha or monastic order. The Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka dealt with philosophical matters. Each Pitaka comprised a number of individual texts. Later, commentaries were written on these texts by Buddhist scholars. As Buddhism traveled to new regions such as Sri Lanka, other texts such as the Dipavamsa, literally, the Chronicle of the Island, and Mahavamsa, the Great Chronicle, were written, containing regional histories of Buddhism. Many of these works contained biographies of the Buddha. Some of the oldest texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to East Asia, pilgrims such as Faxian and Xuanzang traveled all the way from China to India in search of texts. These they took back to their own country, where they were translated by scholars. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places, carrying texts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhist texts were preserved in manuscripts for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese and Tibetan texts. Source 3. Fatalists and Materialists. Here is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka, describing a conversation between King Ajatasattu, the ruler of Magadha, and the Buddha. On one occasion King Ajatasattu visited the Buddha and described what another teacher, named Makhali Gosala, had told him. Though the wise should hope, by this virtue, by this penance I will gain karma, and the fool should by the same means hope to gradually rid himself of his karma, neither of them can do it. Pleasure and pain, measured out as it were, cannot be altered in the course of samsara, transmigration. It can neither be lessened or increased, just as a ball of string will when thrown unwind to its full length, so fool and wise alike will take their course and make an end of sorrow. And this is what a philosopher named Ajita Balan taught. There is no such thing, O king, as alms, or sacrifice, or offerings, there is no such thing as this world or the next. A human being is made up of the 4 elements. When he dies, the earthy in him returns to the earth, the fluid to water, the heat to fire, the windy to air, and his senses pass into space. The talk of gifts is a doctrine of fools, an empty lie. Fools and wise alike are cut off and perish. They do not survive after death. The first teacher belonged to the tradition of the Ajivikas. They have often been described as fatalists, those who believe that everything is predetermined. The second teacher belonged to the tradition of the Lokayatas, usually described as materialists. Texts from these traditions have not survived, so we know about them only from the works of other traditions. Source 4. The World Beyond the Palace. Just as the Buddha's teachings were compiled by his followers, the teachings of Mahavira were also recorded by his disciples. These were often in the form of stories, which could appeal to ordinary people. Here is one example, from a Prakrit text known as the Uttaradhyayana Sutta, describing how a queen named Kamalavati tried to persuade her husband to renounce the world. If the whole world and all its treasures were yours, you would not be satisfied, nor would all this be able to save you. When you die, O king, and leave all things behind, Dhamma alone, and nothing else, will save you. As a bird dislikes the cage, so do I dislike the world. I shall live as a nun without offspring, without desire, without the love of gain, and without hatred. Those who have enjoyed pleasures and renounced them, move about like the wind, and go wherever they please, unchecked like birds in their flight. Leave your large kingdom, abandon what pleases the senses, be without attachment and property, then practice severe penance, being firm of energy. Hagiography is a biography of a saint or religious leader. Hagiographies often praise the saint's achievements, and may not always be literally accurate. They are important because they tell us about the beliefs of the followers of that particular tradition. Source 5. Buddhism in Practice. This is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka, and contains the advice given by the Buddha to a wealthy householder named Sagala. In 5 ways should a master look after his servants and employees: by assigning them work according to their strength, by supplying them with food and wages, by tending them in sickness, by sharing delicacies with them, and by granting leave at times. In 5 ways should the clansman look after the needs of samamas, those who have renounced the world, and brahmanas, by affection in act and speech and mind, by keeping open house to them and supplying their worldly needs. There are similar instructions to Sagala about how to behave with his parents, teacher, and wife. Source 8. Why were stupas built? This is an excerpt from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, part of the Sutta Pitaka. As the Buddha lay dying, Ananda asked him, "What are we to do, Lord, with the remains of the Tathagata, another name for the Buddha?" The Buddha replied, "Hinder not yourselves, Ananda, by honoring the remains of the Tathagata. Be zealous, be intent on your own good." But when pressed further, the Buddha said, "At the 4 crossroads they should erect a thupa, Pali for stupa, to the Tathagata. And whosoever shall there place garlands or perfume, or make a salutation there, or become in its presence calm of heart, that shall long be to them for a profit and joy." In situ means on the spot. Hinayana or Theravada. Supporters of Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of Hinayana. However, followers of the older tradition described themselves as Theravadins, that is, those who followed the path of old, respected teachers, the Theras. Theme through the eyes of travelers. 5 perceptions of society. c. 10th to 17th century. Women and men have traveled in search of work, to escape from natural disasters, as traders, merchants, soldiers, priests, pilgrims, or driven by a sense of adventure. Those who visit or come to stay in a new land invariably encounter a world that is different, in terms of the landscape or physical environment, as well as customs, languages, beliefs, and practices of people. Many of them try to adapt to these differences, others, somewhat exceptional, note them carefully in accounts, generally recording what they find unusual or remarkable. Unfortunately, we have practically no accounts of travel left by women, though we know that they traveled. The accounts that survive are often varied in terms of their subject matter. Some deal with affairs of the court, while others are mainly focused on religious issues, or architectural features and monuments. For example, one of the most important descriptions of the city of Vijayanagara in the 15th century comes from Abdur Razak Samarkandi, a diplomat who came visiting from Herat. In a few cases, travelers did not go to distant lands. For example, in the Mughal Empire, administrators sometimes traveled within the empire and recorded their observations. Some of them were interested in looking at popular customs and the folklore and traditions of their own land. In this chapter we shall see how our knowledge of the past can be enriched through a consideration of descriptions of social life provided by travelers who visited the subcontinent, focusing on the accounts of three men, Al-Biruni who came from Uzbekistan, 11th century, Ibn Battuta who came from Morocco, in northwestern Africa, 14th Turi, and the Frenchman François Berny, since 17th century. As these authors came from vastly different social and cultural environments, they were often more attentive to everyday activities and practices which were taken for granted by indigenous writers, for whom these were routine matters, not worthy of being recorded. It is this difference in perspective that makes the accounts of travelers interesting. Who did these travelers write for? As we will see, the answers vary from one instance to the next. 1. Al-Biruni and the Kitabul Hind. 1.1 From Khwarizm to the Punjab. Al-Biruni was born in 973, in Khwarizm in present-day Uzbekistan. Khwarizm was an important center of learning, and Al-Biruni received the best education available at the time. He was well versed in several languages, Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. Although he did not know Greek, he was familiar with the works of Plato and other Greek philosophers, having read them in Arabic translations. In 1017, when Sultan Mahmud invaded Khwarizm, he took several scholars and poets back to his capital, Ghazni. Al-Biruni was one of them. He arrived in Ghazni as a hostage, but gradually developed a liking for the city, where he spent the rest of his life until his death at the age of 70. It was in Ghazni that Al-Biruni developed an interest in India. This was not unusual. Sanskrit works on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine had been translated into Arabic from the 8th century onwards. When the Punjab became a part of the Ghaznavid Empire, contacts with the local population helped create an environment of mutual trust and understanding. Al-Biruni spent years in the company of Brahmana priests and scholars, learning Sanskrit and studying religious and philosophical texts. While his itinerary is not clear, it is likely that he travelled widely in the Punjab and parts of northern India. Travel literature was already an accepted part of Arabic literature by the time he wrote. This literature dealt with lands as far apart as the Sahara Desert in the west to the river Volga in the north. So, while few people in India would have read Al-Biruni before 1500, many others outside India may have done so. 1.2 The Kitabul Hind. Al-Biruni's Kitabul Hind, written in Arabic, is simple and lucid. It is a voluminous text, divided into 80 chapters on subjects such as religion and philosophy, festivals, astronomy, alchemy, manners and customs, social life, weights and measures, iconography, laws, and metrology. Generally, though not always, Al-Biruni adopted a distinctive structure in each chapter, beginning with a question, following this up with a description based on Sanskritic traditions, and concluding with a comparison with other cultures. Some present-day scholars have argued that this almost geometric structure, remarkable for its precision and predictability, owed much to his mathematical orientation. Al-Biruni, who wrote in Arabic, probably intended his work for peoples living along the frontiers of the subcontinent. He was familiar with translations and adaptations of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit texts into Arabic. These ranged from fables to works on astronomy and medicine. However, he was also critical about the ways in which these texts were written, and clearly wanted to improve on them. 2. Ibn Battuta's Rilla. 2.1 An early globetrotter. Ibn Battuta's book of travels, called Rilla, written in Arabic, provides extremely rich and interesting details about the social and cultural life in the subcontinent in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler was born in Tangier into one of the most respectable and educated families known for their expertise in Islamic religious law or Sharia. True to the tradition of his family, Ibn Battuta received literary and scholastic education when he was quite young. Unlike most other members of his class, Ibn Battuta considered experience gained through travels to be a more important source of knowledge than books. He just loved traveling, and went to far-off places, exploring new worlds and peoples. Before he set off for India in 1332 to 1333, he had made pilgrimage trips to Mecca, and had already traveled extensively in Syria, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, Oman, and a few trading ports on the coast of East Africa. Traveling overland through Central Asia, Ibn Battuta reached Sind in 1333. He had heard about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, and lured by his reputation as a generous patron of arts and letters, set off for Delhi, passing through Multan and Yuk. The Sultan was impressed by his scholarship, and appointed him the Qazi or judge of Delhi. He remained in that position for several years, until he fell out of favor and was thrown into prison. Once the misunderstanding between him and the Sultan was cleared, he was restored to imperial service, and was ordered in 1342 to proceed to China as the Sultan's envoy to the Mongol ruler. With the new assignment, Ibn Battuta proceeded to the Malabar coast through central India. From Malabar he went to the Maldives, where he stayed for 18 months as the Qazi, but eventually decided to proceed to Sri Lanka. He then went back once more to the Malabar coast and the Maldives, and before resuming his mission to China, visited Bengal and Assam as well. He took a ship to Sumatra, and from there another ship for the Chinese port town of Zaitun, now known as Quanzhou. He traveled extensively in China, going as far as Beijing, but did not stay for long, deciding to return home in 1347. His account is often compared with that of Marco Polo, who visited China, and also India, from his home base in Venice in the late 13th century. Ibn Battuta meticulously recorded his observations about new cultures, peoples, beliefs, values, etc. We need to bear in mind that this globetrotter was traveling in the 14th century, when it was much more arduous and hazardous to travel than it is today. According to Ibn Battuta, it took 40 days to travel from Multan to Delhi and about 50 days from Sind to Delhi. The distance from Daulat to Delhi was covered in 40 days, while that from Gwalior to Delhi took 10 days. Traveling was also more insecure. Ibn Battuta was attacked by bands of robbers several times. In fact, he preferred traveling in a caravan along with companions, but this did not deter highway robbers. While traveling from Multan to Delhi, for instance, his caravan was attacked and many of his fellow travelers lost their lives. Those travelers who survived, including Ibn Battuta, were severely wounded. 2.2 The enjoyment of curiosities. As we have seen, Ibn Battuta was an inveterate traveler who spent several years traveling through North Africa, West Asia, and parts of Central Asia. He may even have visited Russia, the Indian subcontinent and China, before returning to his native land, Morocco. When he returned, the local ruler issued instructions that his stories be recorded. 3. François Berny. A doctor with a difference. Once the Portuguese arrived in India in about 1500, a number of them wrote detailed accounts regarding Indian social customs and religious practices. A few of them, such as the Jesuit Roberto Nobili, even translated Indian texts into European languages. Among the best known of the Portuguese writers is Duarte Barbosa, who wrote a detailed account of trade and society in South India. Later, after 1600, we find growing numbers of Dutch, English, and French travelers coming to India. One of the most famous was the French jeweler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who traveled to India at least 6 times. He was particularly fascinated with the trading conditions in India, and compared India to Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Some of these travelers, like the Italian Dr. Manici, never returned to Europe. and settled down in India. François Bernis, a Frenchman, was a doctor, political philosopher, and historian. Like many others, he came to the Mughal Empire in search of opportunities. He was in India for 12 years, from 1656 to 1668, and was closely associated with the Mughal court, as a physician to Prince Dara Shikoh, the eldest son of Emperor Shah Jahan, and later as an intellectual and scientist, with Danish Mand Khan, an Armenian noble at the Mughal court. 3.1 Comparing East and West. Bernis traveled to several parts of the country, and wrote accounts of what he saw, frequently comparing what he saw in India with the situation in Europe. He dedicated his major writing to Louis XIV, the King of France, and many of his other works were written in the form of letters to influential officials and ministers. In virtually every instance Bernis described what he saw in India as a bleak situation in comparison to developments in Europe. As we will see, this assessment was not always accurate. However, when his works were published, Bernis' writings became extremely popular. Bernis' works were published in France in 1670 to 1671 and translated into English, Dutch, German and Italian within the next 5 years. Between 1670 and 1725 his account was reprinted 8 times in French, and by 1684 it had been reprinted 3 times in English. This was in marked contrast to the accounts in Arabic and Persian, which circulated as manuscripts and were generally not published before 1800. 10. Making Sense of an Alien World. Al-Biruni and the Sanskritic Tradition. 4.1 Overcoming Barriers to Understanding. As we have seen, travelers often compared what they saw in the subcontinent with practices with which they were familiar. Each traveler adopted distinct strategies to understand what they observed. Al-Biruni, for instance, was aware of the problems inherent in the task he had set himself. He discussed several barriers that he felt obstructed understanding. The first amongst these was language. According to him, Sanskrit was so different from Arabic and Persian that ideas and concepts could not be easily translated from one language into another. The second barrier he identified was the difference in religious beliefs and practices. The self-absorption and consequent insularity of the local population, according to him, constituted the third barrier. What is interesting is that even though he was aware of these problems, Al-Biruni depended almost exclusively on the works of Brahmanas, often citing passages from the Vedas, the Puranas, the Bhagavad Gita, the works of Patanjali, the Manusmriti, etc., to provide an understanding of Indian society. 4.2 Al-Biruni's description of the caste system. Al-Biruni tried to explain the caste system by looking for parallels in other societies. He noted that in ancient Persia, 4 social categories were recognized: those of knights and princes, monks, fire priests and lawyers, physicians, astronomers and other scientists, and finally, peasants and artisans. In other words, he attempted to suggest that social divisions were not unique to India. At the same time he pointed out that within Islam all men were considered equal, differing only in their observance of piety. In spite of his acceptance of the Brahmanical description of the caste system, Al-Biruni disapproved of the notion of pollution. He remarked that everything which falls into a state of impurity strives and succeeds in regaining its original condition of purity. The sun cleanses the air, and the salt in the sea prevents the water from becoming polluted. If it were not so, insisted Al-Biruni, life on earth would have been impossible. The conception of social pollution, intrinsic to the caste system, was according to him, contrary to the laws of nature. As we have seen, Al-Biruni's description of the caste system was deeply influenced by his study of normative Sanskrit texts which laid down the rules governing the system from the point of view of the Brahmanas. However, in real life the system was not quite as rigid. For instance, the categories defined as Antyaja, literally, born outside the system, were often expected to provide inexpensive labor to both peasants and zamindars. In other words, while they were often subjected to social oppression, they were included within economic networks. 5. Ibn Battuta and the excitement of the unfamiliar. By the time Ibn Battuta arrived in Delhi in the 14th century, the subcontinent was part of a global network of communication that stretched from China in the east to northwest Africa and Europe in the west. As we have seen, Ibn Battuta himself traveled extensively through these lands, visiting sacred shrines, spending time with learned men and rulers, often officiating as qazi, and enjoying the cosmopolitan culture of urban centers where people who spoke Arabic, Persian, Turkish and other languages shared ideas, information, and anecdotes. These included stories about men noted for their piety, kings who could be both cruel and generous, and about the lives of ordinary men and women. Anything that was unfamiliar was particularly highlighted in order to ensure that the listener or the reader was suitably impressed by accounts of distant yet accessible worlds. 5.1 The Coconut and the Pawn. Some of the best examples of Ibn Battuta's strategies of representation are evident in the ways in which he described the coconut and the pawn, two kinds of plant produce that were completely unfamiliar to his audience. 5.2 Ibn Battuta and Indian cities. Ibn Battuta found cities in the subcontinent full of exciting opportunities for those who had the necessary drive, resources, and skills. They were densely populated and prosperous, except for the occasional disruptions caused by wars and invasions. It appears from Ibn Battuta's account that most cities had crowded streets and bright and colorful markets that were stacked with a wide variety of goods. Ibn Battuta described Delhi as a vast city, with a great population, the largest in India. Daulatabad, in Maharashtra, was no less, and easily rivaled Delhi in size. The bazaars were not only places of economic transactions, but also the hub of social and cultural activities. Most bazaars had a mosque and a temple, and in some of them at least, spaces were marked for public performances by dancers, musicians, and singers. While Ibn Battuta was not particularly concerned with explaining the prosperity of towns, historians have used his account to suggest that towns derived a significant portion of their wealth through the appropriation of surplus from villages. Ibn Battuta found Indian agriculture very productive because of the fertility of the soil, which allowed farmers to cultivate 2 crops a year. He also noted that the subcontinent was well integrated with inter-Asian networks of trade and commerce, with Indian manufactures being in great demand in both West Asia and Southeast Asia, fetching huge profits for artisans and merchants. Indian textiles, particularly cotton cloth, fine muslins, silks, brocade, and satin, were in great demand. Ibn Battuta informs us that certain varieties of fine muslin were so expensive that they could be worn only by the nobles and the very rich. 5.3 A unique system of communication. The state evidently took special measures to encourage merchants. Almost all trade routes were well supplied with inns and guest houses. Ibn Battuta was also amazed by the efficiency of the postal system, which allowed merchants to not only send information and remit credit across long distances, but also to dispatch goods required at short notice. The postal system was so efficient that while it took 50 days to reach Delhi from Sindh, the news reports of spies would reach the Sultan through the postal system in just 5 days. 6. Varna and the Degenerate East. If Ibn Battuta chose to describe everything that impressed and excited him because of its novelty, François Varna belonged to a different intellectual tradition. He was far more preoccupied with comparing and contrasting what he saw in India with the situation in Europe in general and France in particular, focusing on situations which he considered depressing. His idea seems to have been to influence policymakers and the intelligentsia to ensure that they made what he considered to be the right decisions. Varna's travels in the Mughal Empire is marked by detailed observations, critical insights and reflection. His account contains discussions trying to place the history of the Mughals within some sort of a universal framework. He constantly compared Mughal India with contemporary Europe, generally emphasizing the superiority of the latter. His representation of India works on the model of binary opposition, where India is presented as the inverse of Europe. He also ordered the perceived differences hierarchically, so that India appeared to be inferior to the Western world. 6.1 The question of land ownership. According to Berni, one of the fundamental differences between Mughal India and Europe was the lack of private property in land in the former. He was a firm believer in the virtues of private property, and saw crown ownership of land as being harmful for both the state and its people. He thought that in the Mughal Empire the emperor owned all the land and distributed it among his nobles, and that this had disastrous consequences for the economy and society. This perception was not unique to Berni, but is found in most travelers' accounts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Owing to crown ownership of land, argued Berni, landholders could not pass on their land to their children. So they were averse to any long-term investment in the sustenance and expansion of production. The absence of private property in land had, therefore, prevented the emergence of the class of improving landlords, as in Western Europe, with the concern to maintain or improve the land. It had led to the uniform ruination of agriculture, excessive oppression of the peasantry and a continuous decline in the living standards of all sections of society, except the ruling aristocracy. As an extension of this, Berni described Indian society as consisting of undifferentiated masses of impoverished people, subjugated by a small minority of a very rich and powerful ruling class. Between the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich, there was no social group or class worth the name. Berni confidently asserted, there is no middle state in India. This, then, is how Berni saw the Mughal Empire. Its king was the king of beggars and barbarians, its cities and towns were ruined and contaminated with ill air, and its fields, overspread with bushes and full of pestilential marishis. And, all this was because of one reason, crown ownership of land. Curiously, none of the Mughal official documents suggest that the state was the sole owner of land. For instance, Abu al-Fazl, the 16th century official chronicler of Akbar's reign, describes the land revenue as remunerations of sovereignty, a claim made by the ruler on his subjects for the protection he provided rather than as rent on land that he owned. It is possible that European travelers regarded such claims as rent because land revenue demands were often very high. However, this was actually not a rent or even a land tax, but a tax on the crop. Berni's descriptions influenced Western theorists from the 18th century onwards. The French philosopher Montesquieu, for instance, used this account to develop the idea of Oriental despotism, according to which rulers in Asia, the Orient or the East, enjoyed absolute authority over their subjects, who were kept in conditions of subjugation and poverty, arguing that all land belonged to the king and that private property was non-existent. According to this view, everybody, except the emperor and his nobles, barely managed to survive. This idea was further developed as the concept of the Asiatic mode of production by Karl Marx in the 19th century. He argued that in India, and other Asian countries, before colonialism, surplus was appropriated by the state. This led to the emergence of a society that was composed of a large number of autonomous and, internally, egalitarian village communities. The imperial court presided over these village communities, respecting their autonomy as long as the flow of surplus was unimpeded. This was regarded as a stagnant system. However, as we will see, this picture of rural society was far from true. In fact, during the 16th and 17th centuries, rural society was characterized by considerable social and economic differentiation. At one end of the spectrum were the big zamindars, who enjoyed superior rights in land, and, at the other, the untouchable landless laborers. In between was the big peasant, who used hired labor and engaged in commodity production, and the smaller peasant who could barely produce for his subsistence. 6.2 A more complex social reality. While Berni's preoccupation with projecting the Mughal state as tyrannical is obvious, his descriptions occasionally hint at a more complex social reality. For instance, he felt that artisans had no incentive to improve the quality of their manufactures, since profits were appropriated by the state. Manufactures were, consequently, everywhere in decline. At the same time, he conceded that vast quantities of the world's precious metals flowed into India, as manufactures were exported in exchange for gold and silver. He also noticed the existence of a prosperous merchant community, engaged in long-distance exchange. In fact, during the 17th century about 15% of the population lived in Indiana towns. This was, on average, higher than the proportion of urban population in Western Europe in the same period. In spite of this, Berni described Mughal cities as camp towns, by which he meant towns that owed their existence, and depended for their survival, on the imperial camp. He believed that these came into existence when the imperial court moved in and rapidly declined when it moved out. He suggested that they did not have viable social and economic foundations but were dependent on imperial patronage. As in the case of the question of land ownership, Berni was drawing an oversimplified picture. There were all kinds of towns, manufacturing towns, trading towns, port towns, sacred centers, pilgrimage towns, etc. Their existence is an index of the prosperity of merchant communities and professional classes. Merchants often had strong community or kin ties, and were organized into their own caste occupational bodies. In western India these groups were called Mahajans, and their chief, the Sheth. In urban centers such as Ahmedabad the Mahajans were collectively represented by the chief of the merchant community who was called the Nagar Sheth. Other urban groups included professional classes such as physicians, Hakim or Vaid, teachers, Pundit or Mullah, lawyers, Wakil, painters, architects, musicians, calligraphers, etc. While some depended on imperial patronage, many made their living by serving other patrons, while still others served ordinary people in crowded markets or bazaars. 7. Women. Slaves, sati, and laborers. Travelers who left written accounts were generally men who were interested in and sometimes intrigued by the condition of women in the subcontinent. Sometimes they took social inequities for granted as a natural state of affairs. For instance, slaves were openly sold in markets, like any other commodity, and were regularly exchanged as gifts. When Ibn Battuta reached Sindh he purchased horses, camels, and slaves as gifts for Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. When he reached Multan, he presented the governor with a slave and horse together with raisins and almonds. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, informs Ibn Battuta, was so happy with the sermon of a preacher named Nasir-ud-Din that he gave him 100,000 tonkas, coins, and 200 slaves. It appears from Ibn Battuta's account that there was considerable differentiation among slaves. Some female slaves in the service of the Sultan were experts in music and dance, and Ibn Battuta enjoyed their performance at the wedding of the Sultan's sister. Female slaves were also employed by the Sultan to keep a watch on his nobles. Slaves were generally used for domestic labor, and Ibn Battuta found their services particularly indispensable for carrying women and men on palanquins or dola. The price of slaves, particularly female slaves required for domestic labor, was very low, and most families who could afford to do so kept at least one or two of them. Contemporary European travelers and writers often highlighted the treatment of women as a crucial marker of difference between Western and Eastern societies. Not surprisingly, Berni chose the practice of sati for detailed description. He noted that while some women seemed to embrace death cheerfully, others were forced to die. However, women's lives revolved around much else besides the practice of sati. Their labor was crucial in both agricultural and non-agricultural production. Women from merchant families participated in commercial activities, sometimes even taking mercantile disputes to the court of law. It therefore seems unlikely that women were confined to the private spaces of their homes. You may have noticed that travelers' accounts provide us with a tantalizing glimpse of the lives of men and women during these centuries. However, their observations were often shaped by the contexts from which they came. At the same time, there were many aspects of social life that these travelers did not notice. Also relatively unknown are the experiences and observations of men, and possibly women, from the subcontinent who crossed seas and mountains and ventured into lands beyond the subcontinent. What did they see and hear? How were their relations with peoples of distant lands shaped? What were the languages they used? These and other questions will hopefully be systematically addressed by historians in the years to come. Timeline. Some travelers who left accounts. 10th–11th centuries. 973 to 1048 Muhammad ibn Ahmad Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. From Uzbekistan. 13th century. 1254 to 1323 Marco Polo, from Italy. 14th century. 1304 to 1377 Ibn Battuta, from Morocco. 15th century. 1413 to 1482 Abd al-Razak Kamal al-Din ibn